We would rather die than see her come back here. That's what I heard through my own phone. No warning, no argument. Just my parents speaking casually as if I wasn't on the line. I'm Casey. I'm 32. And for most of my adult life, I believed family tension could be managed, softened with patience, negotiated with calm responses. I thought if I stayed steady enough, things would settle. That night, something in me finally stopped trying. I grew up in Bangor, where family duty wasn't something you discussed. It was something you absorbed. It hung in the air like humidity, thick, invisible, always present. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. We had dinners together. We showed up for holidays. We used the word love often enough. But underneath all of that, there was a ledger, not a literal one. No notebook tucked into a drawer. It was quieter than that. Every favor, every sacrifice, every dollar spent was remembered, cataloged, stored away for a future moment when it could be retrieved. If my parents covered a medical bill when I was young, it wasn't just help, it was investment. If they drove me to school events or paid for winter coats, it became part of a narrative about what children owe their parents. Gratitude wasn't enough. Gratitude expired. Repayment did not. As I got older, I started trying to show that I understood. When winters were tight, I wired money. Not because anyone demanded it directly at first, but because the atmosphere suggested that good daughters anticipate need. If I bought groceries before the holidays, it wasn't framed as generosity. It became the new baseline. The next holiday, the bags were expected. If I transferred money once, the second time felt less like kindness and more like compliance. There was never a moment when someone said, "Thank you." That was thoughtful. Instead, the gesture folded into the ledger. The message was subtle but constant. If you can give, you should. If you hesitate, you're selfish. Independence in that environment wasn't neutral. It was suspicious. When I rented a small studio in Bangor in my early 20s, I thought it would signal growth, a natural next step. Instead, it was treated like a temporary phase, an extended sleepover with adulthood. My parents spoke as though I would eventually come to my senses and move back home. Even after I secured stable income, even after I paid my own bills without assistance, their assumption didn't change. The model in their minds had no space for autonomy. Living alone wasn't proof of responsibility, it was evidence of distance. My father talked constantly about responsibility. It was one of his favorite words. But over time, I realized it didn't mean what I thought it meant. Responsibility in his vocabulary wasn't about managing your own life well. It was about remaining accessible. If I could afford rent, I could afford to contribute more to the household. If I bought new tires, that meant I had disposable income. If I saved money, that meant I was withholding resources that rightfully belonged to the family. He dressed these expectations in moral language. Parents sacrifice for decades, he would say. Children repay that sacrifice when they become adults. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, almost noble, but the logic had no ceiling. There was no point at which repayment was considered complete. And then there was Jason. My older brother never moved out for long. He drifted in and out of small plans, but stayed physically close. His presence alone counted as loyalty. That was the word used for him. Loyal. He didn't contribute consistently. He borrowed money and missed deadlines. He avoided steady work for stretches of time. But when he struggled, it was called a phase. When he stayed in Bangor without offering much, it was framed as devotion. I remember noticing the difference before I had language for it. When I paid my bills on time and kept my apartment clean, my mother would say I was becoming distant. When Jason spent afternoons on the couch without contributing, she would say he was going through something. If he visited our parents twice a month, he was praised. If I declined to show up every weekend, I was questioned. If he needed money, it was support. If I hesitated to send money, it was disrespect. The contrast wasn't hidden. It was almost deliberate. Jason's lack of contribution was absorbed without complaint. My competence became a measuring stick. The more stable I became, the higher the expectations climbed. It took me years to understand that in Bangor, contribution was not rewarded. It was leveraged. Love began to feel like interest on an emotional loan. If my parents mentioned something they'd done for me in childhood, it wasn't nostalgic. It was strategic, a reminder, a subtle recalculation of what I owed. Even holidays carried a transactional undercurrent. If I showed up for Thanksgiving, someone would joke softly that maybe next year I'd stay for good. There was always a suggestion that returning permanently was the logical next step, as if independence were a detour rather than a life. When I talked about my career goals, the response wasn't curiosity, it was correction. Goals don't excuse distance, my mother would say gently. My father was more direct. Your job should benefit your family. The phrase sounded supportive at first. Of course, family matters. Of course you show up. But over time, I realized that showing up meant surrendering decision-making power. In that house, responsibility wasn't shared evenly. It was assigned based on capacity. If you demonstrated strength, you were expected to carry more. If you demonstrated weakness, you were protected. Jason's dependency was reframed as vulnerability. My independence was reframed as arrogance. And because I was the one who could pay the one who planned, the one who saved the ledger kept growing in my direction. What unsettled me most wasn't the money. It was the assumption behind it. The belief that adulthood meant permanent access. That no matter where I lived, how I worked, or what I built, my resources remained communal property. When I tried to describe boundaries, the word itself was treated like an accusation. Boundaries implied mistrust, and mistrust in our family was the ultimate betrayal. So I adjusted myself instead. I kept my tone calm. I kept my explanations measured. I tried to prove that independence wasn't abandonment. I told myself that if I stayed patient enough, steady enough, the tension would eventually dissolve. But each gesture of support only deepened the pattern. Each transfer of money reinforced the narrative that my income was a family asset. Each polite refusal was recorded as rebellion. Looking back, I see how the system functioned. Responsibility was the code word. It sounded virtuous. It sounded adult. But what it really meant was compliance. It meant proximity. It meant financial availability without negotiation. And because I was capable, I became the target. Jason didn't need to prove loyalty through sacrifice. His mere presence satisfied the requirement. I, on the other hand, had to prove loyalty through surrender. The hierarchy was clear. One child was preserved. The other was extracted from. In Bangor, love wasn't expressed through freedom. It was expressed through obligation. The more you gave, the more was expected. And if you questioned the terms the story shifted, you weren't overwhelmed, you were ungrateful. It took me a long time to recognize that nothing I offered would ever reset the ledger to zero. There was no finish line, no moment when someone would say, "You've done enough." There was only the quiet understanding that competence meant capacity, and capacity meant responsibility. And responsibility, spoken softly, repeated often, meant control. The message came on an ordinary evening. No build-up, no check-in, no "How have you been?" "It's your responsibility now." That was the final sentence. Before it, a brief explanation: the roof was leaking. Repairs would cost $2,000. The numbers sat there in the text like a demand already approved. There was no greeting, no question mark, no pause that suggested conversation. Just a statement dressed up as necessity. I stared at the screen longer than I expected to. Not because of the amount. I had sent money before. I knew how to transfer it in less than a minute. What held my attention was the phrasing: responsibility, not help, not support, not even "could you." Responsibility now implied a transfer of ownership, as if something invisible had shifted and I had missed the ceremony. I tried to trace the moment when my income had stopped being mine and started being communal property. When had assistance become obligation? When had emergencies become invoices? The leak itself wasn't what unsettled me. Roofs fail, houses age, weather doesn't negotiate, but something in the tone told me this wasn't about shingles or insulation. It was about confirmation. I put the phone down, then picked it back up. I typed slowly. Not because I was unsure, but because I knew clarity mattered more than speed. I explained that I had my own expenses, that I budgeted carefully, that I couldn't commit to ongoing financial demands that arrived without discussion. I reminded her that I lived independently, that my income had structure and purpose. I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize, I just stated a boundary in plain language. When I pressed send, something shifted inside my chest. It wasn't defiance, it was steadiness, like placing a chair firmly on uneven ground. Her response came almost immediately. She ignored every sentence I had written. Instead, she accused me of abandoning my family. She said questioning the request showed a lack of character. She told me that real adults don't hesitate when their parents need help. That if I wanted to remain part of the family, I needed to step up without negotiation. There it was again, no space for dialogue, only compliance. I read her message twice, just to be sure I wasn't misinterpreting it. The roof had disappeared from the center of the conversation. In its place stood loyalty, morality, belonging. This wasn't about fixing a leak. It was about whether I would confirm their access to me. Before I could finish processing her words, another notification appeared. "Jason, I've always known you were ungrateful," he wrote. "This proves it." No mention of the roof, no mention of contributing himself, no curiosity about my situation. Just a verdict. He said loyalty mattered. He said family came first. He said I had a pattern of putting myself above everyone else. The phrasing felt rehearsed, like something repeated in private conversations before it reached my screen. I could almost hear the echo of my mother's voice behind his. What struck me wasn't the insult. It was the symmetry. Neither of them asked what I could afford. Neither of them asked how I was managing. Neither of them suggested splitting the cost. There was no practical discussion about contractors or timelines. The only issue on trial was my obedience. I thought about calling. For a moment, I imagined the conversation voices layered on top of each other, outrage framed as disappointment. But I already understood the structure. A call wouldn't clarify anything. It would just extend the performance. So I typed one final message to my mother. I told her, emergencies don't create ownership over my income. I told her that responsibility doesn't eliminate personal boundaries. I told her that adulthood cannot be validated through forced agreement. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was measured. I pressed send and set the phone down. Her next message arrived longer than the others. She said I needed to evaluate my standing as a functioning adult. She wrote that real families don't question financial duties. She suggested that my hesitation revealed immaturity. Again, no discussion of the roof itself, no logistics, no plan, just judgment. That was the moment everything sharpened. If this had been about weather damage, we would have talked about solutions, payment plans, insurance, shared effort. Instead, the entire exchange revolved around my willingness to surrender without pause. The amount $2,000 was less significant than the precedent. If I sent it without conversation, the ledger would grow again, and the next request would arrive with even less explanation. I realized then that the roof was incidental. What they were testing wasn't my generosity. It was my compliance. I didn't respond again. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar at first. My hands were still, my breathing steady. I waited for guilt to arrive the way it always had before. It didn't. Instead, there was clarity. If I complied, I would confirm that my income existed for their private use. If I refused, I would be labeled defective. There was no path inside that structure that preserved both dignity and belonging. So I chose dignity. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself further. I let their words sit unanswered. For the first time, I saw the pattern without decoration. The emergency was a doorway. The real demand was control. And once you see that clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend you're negotiating about a roof. 2 weeks after the messages about the roof, they told me to come to dinner. It wasn't phrased as an invitation. There was no, if you're free. Just a time, a day, an expectation. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because a small part of me still believed that tone could be reset in person. That maybe without screens between us, something human would surface. The house in Bangor looked the same as it always had. Same paint, same porch light flickering on before sunset. I paused in the driveway longer than necessary, watching the front window glow. My breathing was steady. Inhale, exhale. I reminded myself that calm is power. When I stepped inside, my father, Richard, met me before I could fully close the door. He placed his hand on my shoulder, not gently, not aggressively, just firmly enough to signal possession. "You look tired," he said. It wasn't concern. It was diagnosis. As if the life I'd built outside Bangor had already begun collapsing and he had predicted it. I smiled politely and stepped further into the house. My mother, Elaine, was carrying plates from the kitchen to the table. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't comment on the drive. She simply nodded like we were convening for a meeting that had already been scheduled in her mind. We sat down. The food was served before the conversation began, but no one ate. Richard cleared his throat the way he does when he's about to deliver something final. "It's time," he said. "You need to move back. Permanently." There it was. Not framed as a suggestion, not even disguised as concern. A verdict. He leaned back slightly, watching my reaction the way someone watches a defendant in court. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I focused on my breathing again. Inhale, exhale. "I've built something. Where I am," I said, carefully. "I enjoy my work." He cut the sentence off before it could fully land. "Enjoyment isn't stability," he replied. "Responsible adults stay close to their families. That's how real security works." Independence in his tone sounded like a childish fantasy, like I'd been playing house in another state, and he was here to remind me that adulthood had rules. Elaine set her fork down. "You can't keep pretending distance is maturity," she said softly. "Emotional absence is abandonment." The word abandonment lingered in the air like smoke. I tried to explain that proximity doesn't equal care, that distance doesn't erase love. But even as I spoke, I could see the shift in their expressions. My words weren't being heard. They were being evaluated for disobedience. Jason joined the conversation only after chewing slowly as if savoring his timing. "You've been dramatic for months," he said. "Leaving Bangor poisoned your common sense." His tone carried that familiar mix of casual superiority and rehearsed conviction. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at our parents. Approval passed between them in a glance. I asked him a simple question. "If you had my job, would you move back?" He smirked. "That's different," he said. "You've always had more. That means you owe more." There it was, the selective math. I felt something settle inside me, then not anger. Recognition. Jason had never been asked to sacrifice anything. He wasn't told to relocate. He wasn't expected to contribute utilities or surrender his income. His presence alone satisfied the definition of loyalty. For me, loyalty required dismantling my own life. Richard leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Adulthood means paying attention to the people who built you," he said. "You don't get to detach when it's inconvenient." Detach. The word made my independence sound like cruelty. "I'm not detaching," I replied evenly. "I'm building something." He shook his head, dismissing it. "Your job won't lead anywhere permanent. You're chasing an illusion. Stability is here." Here meant under his roof, within his reach, inside his framework. Elaine's voice softened again, but the message sharpened. "You couldn't even send money without questioning it," she said. "That tells us everything." So we were back to that. The roof had become character evidence. I realized then that nothing I said would matter. Every statement would be filtered through a narrative they had already written. Independence equaled selfishness. Boundaries equal disrespect. Distance equaled betrayal. Jason wiped his hands slowly with a napkin. "Expectations are different for people who can be trusted," he added. I looked at him directly. "And what proves trust?" I asked. "Obedience," he almost said, but stopped short. "Loyalty," he corrected. Richard cut in before the conversation could splinter. "Trust flows upward," he said firmly. "Parents first. Children respond upward, not sideways, not mutual." That was the architecture. This dinner wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about concern for my well-being. It was a performance of authority, a coordinated reinforcement of hierarchy. I became aware of how calm I felt. Not numb, just clear. They weren't asking me to return because they missed me. They were demanding proximity because distance threatened control. The plates in front of us had gone untouched. The food cooled as the lecture continued. Every sentence circled the same point: come back, surrender, restore the order. I imagined my apartment, the quiet mornings, the routine I had built, the small decisions that belonged only to me. I'm not moving back, I said finally. No edge, no raised voice, just a statement. Silence dropped across the table. Richard's jaw tightened. Walking away from family is immature, he said. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back without scraping it against the floor. Staying where I'm not respected would be worse, I replied. Elaine's expression shifted, something between disbelief and indignation. Jason leaned back, arms crossed, as if the outcome confirmed his theory about me. I reached for my keys on the counter. The house felt smaller than it had when I walked in. Not physically, structurally. No one followed me to the door. As I stepped outside, the evening air felt sharper, cleaner. I closed the door behind me without slamming it. No dramatic exit. No final speech. Just a quiet decision carried into motion. I walked to my car, breathing in, breathing out, aware that something had just ended. Not because I had declared it, but because I had refused to participate in its design. The engine started. The porch light remained on. And for the first time, leaving didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like alignment. A few days after that dinner, I stopped replaying the conversation and started looking at logistics. If distance was going to mean anything, it couldn't live only in my head. It had to exist in systems, in passwords, in contracts, in numbers that couldn't be argued with. The first thing I did was call my phone carrier. The representative asked routine questions. Verification codes, last 4 digits billing address. Then she asked why I wanted to change my number. Are you ending a relationship? She said lightly. In a way, I replied, it's about privacy. When the new number became active, I felt something subtle release. My phone had always been a doorway, a direct line for commentary, guilt pressure disguised as concern. Changing the number wasn't dramatic, it was administrative. Clean. I didn't send the new one to my parents. I didn't announce it. Silence doesn't require explanation. Next, I opened the family group chat. Years of messages scrolled upward. Holiday logistics, passive-aggressive reminders, links. I never clicked requests that blurred into expectations. It looked harmless at first glance. Just a thread of conversation. But I knew better. It had become a bulletin board for demands. A place where my responses were monitored. Where delays were interpreted as attitude. I hovered over the settings for a moment, then deleted the entire thread. No archive, no screenshot, just gone. The screen felt lighter. After that, I logged into the streaming account I had been paying for. My parents and Jason had access. They'd never offered to contribute. It had started as convenience. Then it became assumed. I removed their profiles. The action took less than a minute. No notification would explain why. No confrontation required. It wasn't about punishment. It was about removing automatic access to things I funded. I opened my banking app next. There was an old automatic transfer set up years earlier. Small amounts that moved on a recurring basis. At the time, I had created it to make helping feel effortless, like belonging could be scheduled. I deleted it. Then I checked account permissions, making sure no one else had visibility or authority. I confirmed that every login was mine alone. I changed passwords, added two-factor authentication. Each step felt less like cutting someone off and more like locking my own door at night. You don't apologize for securing your home. You don't debate whether you deserve privacy. You just turn the key. With the digital space secured, I looked at my physical one. I had been renting a one-bedroom apartment, comfortable but not strategically positioned. If I wanted full separation, I needed an environment that didn't overlap with old routines or shared knowledge. I scheduled a meeting with my landlord, Patrick. His office smelled faintly of paper and coffee. He gestured to the chair across from him and asked what was going on. I'd like to move into a studio closer to work, I said. Something smaller, quieter. He nodded without pressing for explanation. There's one opening up next month, he said. If you can give 30 days notice, we can make it work. 30 days. A timeline, a transition, a clean break. I submitted the paperwork that week. While the move was processing, I turned my attention to something my father had always mocked: savings. He used to call budgeting a fantasy, a sign of fear. But I had learned that money without structure invites dependence. I calculated 6 months of living expenses: rent, groceries, transportation utilities, healthcare. I added a margin for unexpected repairs or medical costs. Then, I opened a separate savings account and transferred a fixed amount into it. That number wasn't symbolic, it was practical. It meant that if pressure arrived disguised as emergency, I wouldn't be cornered by my own instability. It meant that my refusal wouldn't be weakened by IRF. Knowing those months were covered did something to my breathing. It deepened it. One unresolved piece remained: the belongings still stored at my parents' house. Boxes of childhood items, old clothes, photos, things that once felt like anchors. I considered driving back to retrieve them, but the thought came with an image: standing in the hallway being asked to explain myself. New obligations invented on the spot. Possessions can become leverage, so I left them. Clothes can be replaced, sentimental objects too. Memory doesn't live inside a box. Instead, I went to a thrift store near my apartment and bought a few basic items I needed. Nothing expensive, nothing dramatic. The transaction felt cleaner than revisiting emotional debt. With each completed task, a principle clarified itself. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is loud. It seeks reaction. This was hygiene. You remove what contaminates stability. You secure what belongs to you. You stop participating in systems that require self-erasure. I didn't send a final message declaring new boundaries. I didn't draft a manifesto. If an email came requesting money, I archived it. If a voicemail hinted at urgency, I deleted it. No commentary, no performance. Structure replaced argument. By the time I moved into the studio, the room felt different from any space I'd lived in before. Not because it was larger or more beautiful, it wasn't. It was modest. But every object inside it was chosen without negotiation. Every bill was mine alone. Every password protected only my decisions. Distance, I realized, isn't built through emotion. It's built through systems that no longer require permission. And once those systems are in place, the noise begins to fade. Not because someone else changes, but because access does. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary in its timing. Casey was at her small kitchen table laptop, open a mug cooling beside her. When her mother's name lit up the screen, she hesitated for half a second. Habit, not dread, and answered. "Hi, Mom." Elaine's voice carried its usual brightness, a thin glaze of cheerfulness that never quite reached warmth. She asked about the weather first. Bangor had been gray all week, she said, as if Casey were still there to see it. She asked about work, about traffic, about whether Casey was eating properly. The questions stacked neatly one after another, leaving a little space for real answers. Casey kept her tone level. "Work steady. I'm fine. Yes, I'm eating." There was the faint echo of movement in the background dishes, maybe. A television murmuring. Low, the ordinary domestic soundtrack of the house on Pine Street. It felt strangely distant, like a recording of a place she used to know. Then another voice entered, unfamiliar and close to the receiver. A woman, older perhaps, a neighbor or someone from church. Casey could hear the polite laughter. "And when's she coming to visit Bangor?" the woman asked, casual, curious. "It's been a while, hasn't it?" Casey waited. She expected her mother to offer something neutral. A vague "soon hopefully" or "she's busy." That was how these things usually went. Public harmony maintained, private grievances saved for later. There was a pause, the kind that stretches just a fraction too long. Then her father's voice, clear and unguarded, carried through the phone. "God, I hope never." It wasn't whispered. It wasn't said in jest. It was delivered with a weary kind of certainty, as if he were stating the weather. A soft surprised chuckle from the unfamiliar woman. "Oh, now." And then Elaine, her voice sharper, stripped of its polished tone. "We would rather die than see her come back here." The words landed without echo. No dramatic crack in the line, no distortion. Just clean, unmistakable sound. Casey did not breathe for a moment. Not a gasp, not a sigh. Simply stillness. Her hand tightened slightly around the phone, but her face remained neutral, as if someone were watching her. There was a rustle on the other end, a small intake of breath that suggested someone had realized the line was still open. A faint, hurried murmur. The call ended abruptly. The silence in her kitchen was total. She placed the phone down on the table, face up. The screen had already gone dark. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere above her, a neighbor's footsteps crossed the ceiling. The world had not shifted. The air had not thickened. Nothing visible had changed. Inside her chest, something settled. She did not replay the words immediately. She didn't need to. They were precise enough to stand on their own. "God, I hope never. We would rather die than see her come back here." There had been no anger in her father's tone, no heat in her mother's, just clarity, a statement of preference. Casey stood and rinsed her mug in the sink. The water ran steady. She watched it swirl down the drain, focusing on the movement. Her breathing evened itself out, slow and measured. She did not call back. She did not text. She did not construct a speech in her head, did not draft questions. Why would you say that? Did you mean it? There was nothing to clarify. The sentence had been complete. Her phone buzzed 10 minutes later. Mom, 3 missed calls. Then again, Dad, 1 missed call. A text from Elaine appeared. "Call me back." That was taken out of context. Another buzz. "You misunderstood." Casey looked at the screen without touching it. The phrases felt automatic, preemptive. Not apology, not regret. just damage control. She turned the phone face down. In the quiet that followed, she noticed what she wasn't feeling. There was no surge of outrage, no impulse to defend herself, no desperate need to correct the record. There was instead a kind of recognition. For years, she had been told that distance was her choice, that any strain in the relationship was the result of her stubborn independence. She had been cast as the one who left, the one who withdrew, the one who disrupted the order of things. But this was different. This was not accusation or pressure. It was preference, plainly stated. They did not want her back, not as she was. The phone vibrated again, this time a message from Jason. "What did you do? Mom's upset. You always twist things." Casey read it once. She did not respond. She imagined the scene in the kitchen in Bangor, the quick realization that the line had remained open, the scramble to contain what had slipped out. She could almost see her mother's tight smile, her father's shrug. Perhaps they would tell themselves it had been a joke, a misunderstanding. Casey did not need to argue against that version. The missed calls accumulated. 5, 6. A voicemail notification blinked. She let it sit. The decision not to answer felt less like defiance and more like alignment. For the first time, her silence was not a weapon or a strategy. It was simply appropriate. If they would rather die than see her return, there was nothing to negotiate. Evening settled outside her window, the light thinning into blue. Casey turned on a lamp and opened her laptop again. The ordinary rhythm of her apartment resumed, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the heater. Her phone eventually stopped buzzing. On the table, it lay quiet, a small black rectangle, holding words she did not need to hear again. She did not block their numbers. She did not draft a final message. She did not stage a confrontation in her mind. She allowed the stillness to remain intact. In that stillness, there was no confusion about what had been said, no obligation to reinterpret it into something gentler, no compulsion to chase after reassurance. There was only the clean edge of truth, spoken without performance, and Casey, breathing evenly at her kitchen table, chose not to disturb it. The calls began 2 days later, not from her parents. From Donna. Casey almost didn't recognize the number. She answered out of curiosity more than instinct. "Hey, Donna," said her voice, lower than usual, stripped of its habitual brightness. There was no preamble, no attempt at small talk. "I thought you should know what's going on." Casey leaned back in her chair. "Okay." Donna exhaled audibly. "They tried the bank first. For the roof. The loan didn't go through." A pause. Too much outstanding debt. Not enough steady income on paper. Casey said nothing. "They assumed you'd cover it if the bank said no." Donna continued carefully. "I think that was part of the plan." The word plan hovered in the space between them. And now Casey asked. Now they're scrambling. Donna hesitated. "They thought you'd step in automatically. When you didn't, it caught them off guard." There was no accusation in her tone, only observation. After they hung up, Casey sat still for a moment. The information did not feel like ammunition. It felt like confirmation of a pattern she had already stepped outside of. That evening, Jason called. He didn't ease into it. "I told them I'm not giving money," he said, almost defensively. "I can't. I've got my own expenses." Casey could hear the tension under his words, the tightness of someone cornered. "I didn't ask you to," she replied. "I know." He paused. "They thought I would. But that's not how it works. Not how it works. Casey considered the irony but didn't voice it. For years, how it works had meant that she would handle what others avoided. Responsibility had flowed in one direction. So what happens now, she asked evenly. Jason let out a humorless laugh. They're upset. Dad's angry. Mom's talking about how everyone's turned their back on them. Everyone. The word hung there swollen with implication. And you, Casey asked? I didn't sign up to be the fallback plan, he said quickly. That was always you. There it was unvarnished. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded unsettled, as if the absence of her automatic compliance had shifted the ground beneath his feet. After they hung up, Casey noticed something quiet but undeniable. The system was wobbling. No one had replaced her. No one had stepped neatly into the role she had vacated. The final call came from Nayan. I just wanted you to hear it from me, Nayan said gently. There's talk about they're telling people you abandoned them, that you've changed, that success made you cold. A pause. Some are repeating it. Casey imagined the familiar kitchen tables, the folded arms, the sympathetic clucks of tongues. A tidy narrative, the ungrateful daughter who forgot where she came from. And what do you think Casey asked? Nayan didn't hesitate. I think they're scared. The word landed softly. Scared not of poverty alone, but of instability. Of a structure that had relied on one predictable pillar. Without her quiet funding, her reflexive yes, the arrangement required renegotiation. Casey did not feel vindicated. There was no rush of satisfaction in hearing that the plan had failed, that the expectations had faltered. She felt something steadier than that, recognition. Obligation-based systems appear solid while everyone agrees to their roles. But remove the automatic compliance, the silent ledger, the unspoken guarantee, and the strain becomes visible. The cracks were not new. They had simply been concealed by her participation. Now, without her, the pressure redistributed. And Casey, listening to the distant hum of her apartment after the calls ended, understood that the collapse was not something she had caused. It was something that could no longer sustain itself once consent was withdrawn. 3 months later, the studio felt settled in a way that surprised her. Not glamorous, not symbolic, just steady. She had signed the lease across a narrow desk from Caroline, who slid the papers forward with a practical smile and a pen that scratched decisively against the page. No speeches, no conditions, just a fixed term, a fixed rent, and the quiet understanding that what happened inside those walls belonged to Casey. Her paychecks arrived on the same day each month. The numbers were predictable. Rent left her account without drama. Utilities followed. What remained stayed. There were no emergency transfers, no late-night calculations about who needed what. Stability, she realized, was mostly arithmetic. Camille stopped by one Saturday afternoon with coffee and a small plant that barely fit on the windowsill. They didn't dissect the past. Camille looked around, nodded once, and said, "It suits you." The visit was brief, easy without agenda. Casey noticed how quiet her phone had become. Silence, it turned out, had accomplished more than any carefully worded defense ever had. Without arguments to push against the old dynamics, had nowhere to hook. Independence did not feel triumphant. It felt neutral and underrated state. No rebellion, no victimhood. Just a woman paying her own bills, arranging her own furniture, breathing without bracing. For the first time, she wasn't reacting to anyone. She was simply living. Sometimes the bravest thing we do isn't fighting, it's stepping back. Boundaries aren't walls built from anger, they're quiet lines that protect dignity. Casey's story reminds us that autonomy often requires distance and that choosing peace over performance can change everything. Thank you for listening and holding space for her journey. If this story resonated, consider liking and subscribing to support more reflections like this. Sometimes strength sounds like silence, and that is enough.